There's a moment, quiet, almost invisible, that separates ordinary people from legends. For most men, that moment arrives once, maybe twice in a lifetime. For George Burns, it arrived over and over again, across 10 decades, in vaudeville houses and radio booths and television studios and Hollywood sound stages. He was not merely a comedian who lived a long time. He was a man who refused again and again to be finished. A man who stared down grief and poverty and irrelevance and old age and responded to each of them with a slow drag on a cigar and a perfectly timed joke. His story begins not with applause, but with loss, and it ends 100 years later with a secret no one had expected. The Lower East Side of New York City in the early 1900s was a place of extraordinary density and ordinary desperation. Thousands of immigrant families had pressed themselves into narrow tenement buildings, stacking their lives floor upon floor, sharing walls and staircases, and the particular anxiety of people who had crossed an ocean to find a better life and were still waiting for it to arrive. Nathan Birnbaum was born into this world on January 20th, 1996. He was the 9th of 12 children born to Dorothea and Louis Birnbaum, two Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe who had brought with them little more than their faith, their determination, and their love of music. Louis Birnbaum was a cantor, a singer in the synagogue, and though he could not offer his children material wealth, he gave them something perhaps more lasting, an instinct for performance, for the particular magic of making an audience feel something. But Louis Birnbaum died when Nathan was just 7 years old, and just like that, the music stopped. The death of a father is, in any era, a catastrophic event in the life of a young child. But in the tenements of the Lower East Side in 1903, it was also an economic catastrophe. Dorothea Birnbaum was suddenly responsible for 11 surviving children, one had died in infancy, with no income, no savings, and no safety net beyond the reluctant charity of neighbors and the meager support of her community. Nathan did what young boys in his neighborhood did. He worked. He shined shoes, he sold newspapers, he ran errands. He and a group of neighborhood friends formed a singing group they called the Pee Wee Quartet, performing on street corners and in saloons, passing a hat and dividing whatever coins were tossed their way. It was hardly a living, but for a boy with a natural ear and an instinct for making people smile, it was something more important than money. It was discovery. Nathan Birnbaum discovered in those grimy, energetic street performances that he had a gift. Not the kind of gift that announces itself grandly, not a soaring operatic voice or a dazzling physical presence, but something subtler and in many ways more powerful, the ability to connect, to look at a stranger and make them feel for just a moment that they were in on the joke together, that life, for all its difficulties, was fundamentally absurd. And the right response to absurdity was laughter. He dropped out of school around the age of 14. There was nothing unusual about this for a boy of his background and circumstances. School was a luxury that the poor could rarely afford, not in time, not in attention, not when there were mouths to feed and rent to pay. Nathan took jobs wherever he could find them, as a delivery boy, as a pool hall attendant, as a worker in a fur shop. None of these jobs lasted. None of them satisfied the hunger that had been born on those street corners. What he wanted, with a certainty that surprised even him, was to be in show business. Vaudeville, in the early decades of the 20th century, was the dominant form of popular entertainment in America. Before radio, before motion pictures, before television, there was vaudeville. A rolling, glittering carnival of acts that traveled from city to city, filling theaters with comedy and music and acrobatics and novelty. It was democratic in its ambitions and brutal in its demands. Audiences were not polite. They would sit through a mediocre act in patient silence for a few minutes, and then, if the performer failed to hold them, they would simply start talking among themselves, or worse, begin to boo. For a young man with nothing but ambition and a pair of dancing shoes, it was both an opportunity and a gauntlet. Nathan Birnbaum tried everything. He danced, he sang, he performed comedy bits of his own invention. He appeared under so many different stage names, Willie Delight, Captain Betts, Jed Jackson, that he later joked he could no longer keep track of them himself. The name changes were partly practical. If you bombed under one name, you could book the same theater again under a different one, and nobody would know. It was the early 20th century's version of deleting your social media account and starting fresh. The name George Burns arrived almost by accident. He was, at various points in his early career, working with a partner named Billy Lorraine. They called themselves Burns and Lorraine. When that partnership dissolved, he kept the Burns. The George came from a neighborhood friend named George Birnbaum. Nathan Birnbaum became George Burns, and George Burns, though he did not yet know it, had taken the first step toward immortality. These early years were characterized far more by failure than by success. Burns would later speak about them with an almost fond nostalgia, but the reality was harsh. He was broke with regularity. He ate badly. He slept in cheap boarding houses and on the floors of friends' apartments. He worked terrible rooms for almost no money, performing to audiences who couldn't have cared less whether he lived or died. He was not, by any objective measure, a success. But he was learning. Every failed bit, every bombed joke, every night when the crowd turned against him, all of it was data. All of it was education. Burns was developing through sheer repetition and suffering a philosopher's understanding of what comedy actually was. Not jokes, but timing. Not material, but connection. Not what you said, but the infinitesimal gap between the setup and the punchline, the precise moment when you let the audience's expectations run out ahead of you and then gently, devastatingly pulled the rug. By the time he was in his mid-20s, Burns had been performing for nearly a decade and was still nowhere. He was a journeyman, a circuit comedian, a man whose name appeared in small type at the bottom of playbills. He had talent, he knew he had talent, but talent alone was not enough. Something was missing. That something walked into his life on a rainy evening in 1922 in the form of a small, bright-eyed, utterly extraordinary young woman named Grace Ethel Cecile Rosalie Allen. Grace Allen, who would become known to the world as Gracie Allen, was born in San Francisco on July 26, 1995, making her almost exactly 1 year older than George Burns. Like Burns, she came from a performing family. Her father was a song and dance man, and Gracie had been performing in vaudeville since childhood. By the time she met Burns, she was an experienced and capable performer, part of a sister act that was slowly unraveling. The story of how Burns and Allen met has been told many times, and like all good love stories, it is probably improved with the telling. But the essential facts are these. They met in 1922, formed a professional partnership, and within a year had developed an act that was unlike anything vaudeville audiences had seen before. The premise sounds simple. Burns played the straight man, Allen played the dizzy, illogical, sweetly confused woman whose observations about the world were simultaneously absurd and, in a strange way, more logical than everyone else's. But what made the act extraordinary was not the premise. It was the execution. It was Gracie. Gracie Allen was a comedic genius of a very particular kind. She possessed the rare ability to play stupidity while being obviously intelligent, to deliver lines with an internal logic so consistent and so detailed that the comedy became something more than mere jokes. It became a kind of worldview. Gracie's character experienced the world differently from other people, but not randomly. There was a system to her irrationality, a coherence to her confusion, and audiences responded to it with a kind of delight that went beyond simple laughter. They loved her. Burns recognized immediately that he was in the presence of something extraordinary. He later said that in the original conception of their act, he was supposed to be the funny one, and Gracie was supposed to feed him lines. Within minutes of their first performance together, he realized the equation was entirely reversed. Gracie was getting all the laughs. Gracie was the star. A lesser man, a more insecure man, a man more invested in his own ego than in success, might have resented this. Burns did not resent it for a moment. He understood, with the clarity of a man who had spent years failing, that he had found something more valuable than personal glory. He had found a partner who made the whole enterprise work. His job, he realized, was not to be funny. His job was to be the platform from which Gracie launched herself into comedy. And he was, by universal acclaim, the best straight man in the business. They married on January 7, 1926, at the Cleveland City Hall. It was a practical arrangement in the beginning, the personal and professional so thoroughly intertwined that it was difficult to separate them. But something real developed between them, something that would deepen over more than 3 decades of marriage into one of the most genuine partnerships in the history of American entertainment. Together, they conquered vaudeville. And then, with the instincts of survivors, they looked at what was coming next. Radio arrived in American homes in the early 1920s, and by the end of that decade, it had transformed the country's relationship with entertainment. Suddenly, voices could travel through the air, into living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms, connecting strangers across miles of geography. For performers, it represented both a threat and an opportunity. A threat because it seemed, at first, like it might simply consume your material. You'd tell a joke on the radio and your whole audience would hear it, and then you could never tell it again. And an opportunity because the audience was suddenly nationwide, millions of people rather than hundreds. Burns and Allen made the transition to radio with remarkable ease. Their first major radio appearances came in the early 1930s, and almost immediately they became stars of a new and entirely different magnitude. The characters they had developed in vaudeville, the endlessly logical Gracie, the patient and slightly beleaguered George, translated perfectly to the audio format. In some ways, radio enhanced what they did, because it forced audiences to imagine Gracie rather than simply see her. And imagination always makes things funnier. The Burns and Allen Show on radio ran in various forms from 1934 to 1950. During those 16 years, it became one of the most beloved programs on American radio, a fixture of the national schedule that families arranged their evenings around. Burns and Allen were, in the language of another era, appointment listening. What made the show remarkable, beyond the obvious pleasures of Gracie's comedy, was its structural sophistication. Burns and Allen did not simply perform comedy routines on the radio. They built a world. The show created an elaborate fictional universe that overlapped with their real lives in ways that constantly confused and delighted audiences. George and Gracie played characters named George Burns and Gracie Allen. They talked about their real friends, Jack Benny, Bob Hope, as if they were fictional characters. They acknowledged the artifice of what they were doing, even as they were doing it. This was, in a formal sense, avant-garde. Breaking the fourth wall, acknowledging that the performance is a performance, is a technique that academic literary critics associate with postmodern fiction and experimental theater. Burns and Allen were doing it on the radio in the 1930s in front of audiences who had never heard the term postmodern and didn't need to. They just knew it was funny.
Burns was the architect of this structure. He understood, better than almost anyone in popular entertainment, that the comedy arose not just from individual jokes, but from the relationship between the performer and the audience, from the shared understanding that this was a game they were playing together. When he stepped out of the scene to address the audience directly, he was not breaking immersion. He was inviting the audience more fully into the experience. He was saying, "You are smart enough to understand what we're doing here, and we respect you enough to show you the machinery." Meanwhile, behind the microphones and the studio audiences and the broadcast schedules, George and Gracie were living the complicated private life that all public figures must somehow manage. They had two adopted children, Sandra Jean in 1934 and Ronald John in 1935. They maintained a home in Beverly Hills that became a gathering place for the Hollywood elite. They were, by every visible measure, one of the most successful and harmonious couples in show business. But underneath the harmony, there were complications. There always are. George Burns was, in his public persona, the model of contentment, a man at ease with himself and with the world, whose chief pleasures were his cigar, his cards, his work, and his wife. This image was not entirely false. He did love his work. He did love his wife. He was, by temperament, a sociable and good-natured man who found pleasure in friendship and performance. But he was also a human being, which is to say, a creature capable of selfishness and weakness and the particular failures that come from being alive for a long time in close proximity to other people. In the 1950s, at the height of their television success, George Burns had an affair. The details, even now, are imprecise. What is known, what was eventually revealed by people close to the couple, is that Burns became involved with another woman during the years when the George Burns and Gracie Allen show was one of the most watched programs on American television. He attempted to manage the situation with the gifts that men of his era often employed when their conscience caught up with them: jewelry, flowers, expensive tokens of affection that were simultaneously admissions of guilt. Gracie, who was not stupid, whose entire comic persona was built on a kind of inverse intelligence, a mind that worked sideways rather than straight, knew. She may not have known every detail, but she knew enough. And she chose to say nothing, or nothing that has survived in the historical record. She continued to perform, she continued to be his wife, she continued to be, in public, the Gracie Allen that America loved. What passed between them in private, in the kitchen of their Beverly Hills home, in the quiet moments after the camera stopped and the studio audience went home, we cannot know. The silence between two people who have been together for decades contains multitudes that no outsider can read. What we can observe from a distance is that something changed in Gracie during the 1950s. She had always suffered from heart problems, angina that had plagued her for years and that she had, in the stoic manner of her generation, largely kept private. As the decade wore on, her health worsened. She became quieter, less inclined to socialize, more withdrawn from the public life that had defined her existence for 30 years. In 1958, she told George that she wanted to retire from show business. She had had enough. She was tired. George respected her decision. The show ended, and the two of them settled into a different kind of life together, quieter, more domestic, the long, late days of a marriage that had survived everything. Gracie Allen died on August 27, 1964, of a heart attack. She was 69 years old. George Burns was 68 years old when Gracie died. For a man of his era and temperament, 68 was old, not ancient, but certainly a time when the future had grown shorter than the past. And the future, without Gracie Allen in it, must have seemed not just shorter, but fundamentally different in character, like a piece of music played in the wrong key.
He continued for years afterward to visit her grave at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. He would go alone, or sometimes with a friend, and he would sit there and talk to her about the old routines, about the early days, about the things that had made them laugh. Burns was not, in any traditional sense, a religious man, but he believed in the power of habit and connection, and the habit of talking to Gracie was not one he found easy to break. He also, in those years immediately following her death, struggled to find his professional footing. For 40 years, his identity had been inseparable from hers. George Burns without Gracie Allen was a concept that had no precedent. He was the straight man. But without the funny person to react to, what did a straight man do? He performed. He went on the talk show circuit, he did stand-up, he appeared as a guest on variety programs. He was, by any objective measure, still talented, still quick, still possessed of the timing and the presence that had made him famous. But the acts were smaller somehow, less charged with the electricity that had always crackled between him and Gracie. He played cards, he smoked his cigars, never inhaling, he always insisted, just letting the smoke sit in his mouth, savoring it. He maintained his friendships, particularly with Jack Benny, who was his closest friend and who understood, as few people could, the particular loneliness of the entertainer in old age. And he waited. Not passively, Burns was never passive, but with the patience of a man who had been in show business long enough to understand that careers have rhythms, and that the right moment always arrives for those who are ready when it does. He was, as the 1970s approached, 75 years old. Most people's careers were long finished at 75. Burns had no idea that his greatest triumph was still ahead of him. The phone call came in 1974. Jack Benny, Burns's oldest and dearest friend, had been cast in a film adaptation of Neil Simon's Broadway hit, The Sunshine Boys, playing one of two elderly vaudeville comedians who were brought together for a television special after a decade of bitter estrangement. Benny wanted Burns to play the other role. Then Jack Benny died. He died in December 1974 of pancreatic cancer at the age of 80. His death was another blow to Burns, a man who had already buried his partner, his anchor, and who now had to bury the friend with whom he had shared nearly 60 years of show business. Benny's death left a hole that could not be filled, only lived around. The producers of The Sunshine Boys still needed a cast. They offered the role that Benny had vacated to Walter Matthau. And then, with a logic that felt, in retrospect, almost mythological, they offered the other role to George Burns. Burns was 79 years old. He had not made a major film in decades. The question of whether he could carry a significant role in a major Hollywood production was, to put it generously, open. But he accepted the role, and then he did what he had always done. He showed up, he paid attention, and he worked. The Sunshine Boys was released in 1975. Burns played Al Lewis, the more cheerful and accommodating of the two feuding comedians, and he was, there is no other word for it, magnificent. He brought to the role everything that his 80 decades of life had given him: the timing, the physical economy, the ability to locate the precise gesture that contains a whole character. He and Walter Matthau played off each other with the ease of people who had known each other for years, and the film was a genuine hit, both critically and commercially. At the Academy Awards ceremony in March 1976, George Burns won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. He was 80 years old. He was the oldest person ever to win a competitive Oscar at that time. And when he walked to the microphone to accept the award, he was not a sentimental figure or a novelty or a man being honored for a lifetime of achievement. Was a performer in his prime, at the peak of his craft, being recognized for a specific performance in a specific year. "I don't deserve this," he said, in the particular Burns manner that made every statement sound like the setup for a punchline. "But I have arthritis, and I don't deserve that either." The audience erupted. George Burns was back. The Oscar was not a valediction, it was an introduction. In the years that followed, Burns became something genuinely unprecedented in American entertainment. A man in his 80s who was, by any measure, more popular than he had ever been before. He was booked on every major talk show. He sold out concert venues, not because audiences wanted to see a relic, but because they wanted to see a master at work, a man who had figured out, through decades of practice, exactly how to be funny in the most economical possible way. He made Oh God in 1977, playing the Almighty opposite John Denver's Ernest Everyman, and the film was a surprise hit. The casting was inspired. There was something about Burns, the cigar, the cosmic equanimity, the sense that he had seen everything twice and found most of it amusing, that made him an entirely plausible deity. God, in Burns's portrayal, was not wrathful or mysterious or overwhelming. He was patient, a little world-weary, fundamentally kind, and in possession of a dry sense of humor about the mess his creation had made of things. It was, in other words, exactly how Burns had lived his own life. He continued performing his one-man show well into his 90s. He had booked himself into Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas for a 100th birthday performance, a joke that he made repeatedly, that grew funnier as it grew closer to reality, until suddenly it wasn't a joke anymore, it was an actual booking. He talked about living to 100 with such casual confidence that audiences began to believe it was simply a matter of deciding to do so. His material, in these late years, was almost exclusively about being old, about the particular absurdities of aging, the doctors, the medications, the funerals of contemporaries, the bewildering experience of outliving your own era. He made aging funny not by pretending it wasn't happening, but by looking at it directly, with clear eyes and a comedian's instinct for the gap between what we expect life to be and what it actually is. "I'm at the age," he would say, "where my back goes out more than I do." Or, "Happiness is having a large, loving, caring, close-knit family in another city." Or, perhaps most perfectly, "I look to the future because that's where I'm going to spend the rest of my life." These were not just jokes. They were a philosophy. Burns had worked out, over 90-plus years of living, a way of being in the world that was characterized by acceptance without resignation, by humor without cynicism, by a fundamental enjoyment of the experience of being alive that refused to be diminished by time or loss or the accumulating indignities of old age. He was also, it should be said, an extremely disciplined man. He maintained routines with almost military precision. Up at the same time every morning, breakfast at the same time, the same exercises, the same walk. He worked on his material constantly, not because he was anxious about it, but because the work was the pleasure. He had been performing for 80 years, and he was still curious about how to do it better. That curiosity, that refusal to believe you have learned everything there is to learn, may be the single trait most responsible for his extraordinary longevity, both literal and professional. George Burns died on March 9, 1996. He was 100 years old. He had outlived nearly everyone he had ever known: his parents, his siblings, his wife, his oldest friends, his professional contemporaries, the entire world of vaudeville that had formed him. He died in his Beverly Hills home in a bed that was probably not far from the fireplace where the secret had been waiting. After his death, when his estate was being evaluated and his belongings cataloged, workers discovered something unexpected. Behind the fireplace in his home, there was a vault. And in the vault, there was material that Burns had never shown to anyone. Recordings of old performances, personal correspondence, mementos of a career that stretched back to the early decades of the 20th century. There were recordings of the vaudeville acts, recordings of the early radio programs, evidence of a life in performance that was more extensive and more carefully preserved than anyone had known. There were also letters. The letters illuminated aspects of Burns's private life that the public had not known about: the affair and the reconciliation, or the attempted one, the gifts he had given Gracie, the expensive jewelry and other tokens that he had purchased during the years of his infidelity, and which she had accepted with the particular silence of a woman who has decided to stay. The letters between them, in the years after the affair, that showed a relationship working to rebuild itself, two people who had been partners in every sense of the word, trying to find their way back to each other. It was not a simple story. It was not the story that the public had been told, the perfect partnership, the eternal love, the comedy team that never had an off day. It was the more complicated and more human story of two people who had built something extraordinary together, who had damaged it, and who had chosen, over the easier alternatives of separation or resentment, to repair it. That they managed this repair, that the marriage endured until Gracie's death, that Burns continued to visit her grave for 30 years after she died, that he never stopped talking about her as the great love and the great comedy of his life, suggests that whatever damage the affair had done, it was not the whole of the story. It was a chapter. The marriage was the whole book. When George Burns's will was read, his two children, Sandra and Ronald, discovered that they had been written out of it. This was, by any measure, a dramatic revelation. Burns had been one of the most successful entertainers in American history. His estate was substantial, and he had chosen to leave it not to his children, but to charitable causes. The reasons for this decision have been analyzed and speculated about extensively, and probably no definitive answer can be given. Burns left some indications in various interviews and statements over the years that he believed inherited wealth was not a gift but a burden, that it robbed people of the necessity of building their own lives, of developing their own relationship to work and to the world. There were also, inevitably, the complicated dynamics of a family that had been constructed around two parents of extraordinary fame and achievement. Sandra and Ronald Burns had grown up in the shadow of two of the most beloved entertainers in America. Whatever they achieved in their own lives, they achieved it in that shadow. The relationship between Burns and his children was reportedly warm, but not uncomplicated. The warmth of a man who loved his children, but whose life and attention had always, ultimately, been oriented toward the audience rather than the household. Burns left his estate primarily to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center and to various other charitable organizations, particularly those connected to the entertainment community. It was, in a sense, consistent with the life he had lived, a man who had received so much from the public, returning something to the broader human community in his final act. His children, understandably, had complicated feelings about this, but whatever those feelings were, they remain largely private. The public record shows the decision, not the conversation that led to it. What the will reveals, beyond the specific financial arrangements, is something about Burns's fundamental character, the sense that his life belonged to something larger than his immediate family, that the obligations he felt most acutely were not to his heirs, but to the institutions and communities that had made his life possible. He had grown up in poverty, supported by the charity of a community. He died wealthy, returning what he could to the communities that remained.
What does it mean to be funny for 80 years? What does it require of a person, and what does it leave behind? George Burns was funny in vaudeville theaters, where audiences threw things at performers who failed to entertain them. He was funny on radio, where the absence of visuals forced him to develop a different kind of timing, more precise, more dependent on inflection and pause. He was funny on television, in a medium that required him to rebuild his act around the technology of the close-up, the cut, the domestic living room where viewers sat in their pajamas and watched. He was funny in his 80s and 90s, in a genre of his own invention, the centenarian stand-up, the man whose age had become both his subject and his greatest comic prop. Each of these eras required a different kind of funny. Each of them asked Burns to adapt, to shed what no longer worked and find what did. He did this without apparent effort, though of course it required enormous effort. The effort was simply invisible, which is the mark of mastery. What he understood at the deepest level was that comedy is not about jokes. Jokes are the surface. Comedy is about connection,
the shared recognition between performer and audience that life is stranger and more difficult and more absurd than it ought to be, and that this is actually fine. That laughter is the appropriate response to the gap between what we expect and what we get. That the right joke at the right moment is an act of solidarity, a way of saying, yes, I see it too. Yes, I know. Burns had a particular gift for making audiences feel seen, not flattered, not pandered to, seen. His comedy came from a place of genuine observation, genuine recognition of the human condition, and audiences responded to this with a loyalty that outlasted every change of era and medium. He was also, beneath all the craft and the timing and the philosophy, simply a funny man. He had a way of looking at the world that found absurdity in the most ordinary places, and he had the ability to communicate that absurdity with the minimum number of words necessary. He was economical in the way that only the truly gifted are, aware that the joke is always in danger of being over-explained, that the laugh lives in the gap before the punchline, and that the comedian's job is to create the gap and then step aside. The secret of a good sermon, he once said, is to have a good beginning and a good ending, and to have the two as close together as possible. He was talking about sermons. He was talking about everything. George Burns was born Nathan Birnbaum in a tenement on the Lower East Side of New York City, the ninth of 12 children, in a year when the Wright brothers had not yet flown, and movies did not yet have sound, and the country he would come to represent, the America of mass entertainment, of radio and television and Hollywood, of the celebrity who is simultaneously real and constructed, did not yet exist in any form he would have recognized. He died 100 years later in a home in Beverly Hills as one of the most recognized and beloved figures in the history of American entertainment, in a country that had been transformed almost beyond recognition in the course of his lifetime. Between those 2 points, the tenement and the Beverly Hills home, Nathan Birnbaum and George Burns, there is a story of almost unimaginable scope and duration. It is a story about poverty and ambition and failure and persistence. It is a story about a marriage that was a comedy act and a love affair and a business partnership and eventually a loss that never fully healed. It is a story about the way that a person can be shaped by grief, by the death of a father at 7, by the slow dying of a wife, by the accumulating losses of a very long life, and still find in the business of making people laugh something like a reason to continue. Burns outlived vaudeville, outlived radio, outlived the golden age of television, outlived most of the people who had loved him and whom he had loved. He outlived, in a sense, the era that had made him, and then he had the astonishing audacity to make himself again for an entirely new era, in front of audiences who had not been born when he and Gracie were first making America laugh.
He was not a perfect man. The vault behind the fireplace confirmed what anyone who paid attention might have suspected, that the cheerful surface concealed complications, that the perfect marriage had its fractures, that George Burns was a human being, with the full range of human capacities for both devotion and betrayal. The affair was real. The pain it caused was real. The decades of repair were real. But the love was also real. The fact that he went again and again to talk to Gracie at Forest Lawn, that he kept talking to her for 30 years after she died, is not the behavior of a man performing sentiment. It is the behavior of a man who understood in the marrow of his bones that the partnership had been the greatest thing in his life, that whatever he had done to damage it, the love underneath was something that his failures had not been able to reach. He had booked himself into Caesar's Palace for his 100th birthday. He did not make that performance. But the fact that he had booked it, the insistence right up to the edge of the impossible, that the show would go on, that he would be there, cigar in hand, ready to deliver the next line, tells you everything you need to know about George Burns.
The secret was never the vault. The secret was simpler and more universal, that a life fully committed to the work of connecting with other people, of finding the shared absurdity that makes the difficult bearable, is a life worth living for as long as possible. George Burns lived that life for 100 years, and the audience, which had loved him for 80 of them, never stopped laughing.